Bull gouge versus spindle gouge. What's the difference? Hi, I'm Kent, and today we're going to talk about the difference between a bull gouge and a spindle gouge. They look very similar. They have kind of similar shapes. They cut in a similar manner, but they are very different. And one of them is a little dangerous and can be dangerous for us if we're turning wood bulls. So let's take a closer look. When we first look at the bull gouge and the spindle gouge up close, we can see that the bull gouge shape is more like U-shape. Actually, this bull gouge is a parabolic bull gouge. And you compare that shape to the spindle gouge. The spindle gouge is more of an open, flat curve. The flute on the spindle gouge is very open, just goes across the top, whereas the flute on the bull gouge is more U-shaped. Those are very important. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that these are from two different classes of turning. The spindle gouge is with a group of tools that are designed for spindle work, and the bull gouge is, as you guessed it, is for bull turning, but in particular is for side grain oriented bull blanks. The spindle gouge is really designed for spindle oriented blanks. And when I say spindle, I mean end to end or straight grain. The grain runs from the headstock to the tail stock. Here I have a blank that is end grain. It is basically running, the grain is running from the headstock all the way to the tail stock. So if this were growing in the tree, it's basically the tree standing up, now it's laying on its side. That's how end grain is oriented. This is what the spindle gouge is best at cutting and working with. So let's take a look and see how this works. So spindle cuts like this, where the gouge is used to make beads and coves. Is perfect to be done with the spindle gouge. And I want to show you something here real quick. This cut is a great example of what the spindle gouge can create. With that sharp point, it can get in here and make a really nice edge in a turning like this. Now you might be asking, can the bull gouge do that? Well, yes it can. The only difference is that the bull gouge doesn't quite have that same pointed tip when it gets down into that little crevice to make a nice crisp corner. So to get a crisp corner like that, you really need to use a spindle gouge and not a bull gouge. But if you're comfortable using the bull gouge, you can use a bull gouge on the spindle turning without any problem. You just need to know that you're going to have some limitations because of the shape of the tool as far as how much you want to do there. So let me show you a little bit what we can do with the bull gouge on the spindle turning. And right there you can see I can't really get that nice crisp edge like I can with the spindle gouge. Now, I could combine the two and come in here with the spindle and finish up and put a nice sharp edge in there. Maybe round that a bit. So that's an example. This is a great example of a spindle turning and what the spindle gouge does the best. This is what it's designed to do, to make coves and beads and to turnings with spindle work. I want you guys to understand that the grain is running continuous through this throughout the entire piece. If we bring up our toilet paper roll example again, it's oriented like this. So when this spindle gouge is going through it, it's basically just cutting through layers of fiber and cutting through them at like a 90-degree angle and parting them away from the tool. So when this rotates, we've got a really smooth, we've got nice, even, consistent material to be cutting through when we're in a spindle orientation or an end-to-end mounted blank. This is a side grain mounted bowl blank. If you can see here, we've got grain that's running sideways through this. So unlike the orientation of an end grain turning, this is now perpendicular to the rotation. So instead of being like an end grain turning, it's more like this. And now the blank is turning end over end. This being end grain on both sides and then side grain beside it. That's how a typical bowl blank. Now, you can make a bowl that is an end grain bowl, but the majority of most bowls are side grain mounted like this. This is ideally suited for the bowl gouge and the bowl gouge only. Why? Well, the reason why is that this has enough stout or strength to cut those end grain fibers when they come around, because they're coming down with force perpendicular to the tool, and it's a lot of energy that's exerted. Unlike the spindle turning, where it's just kind of a continuous pressure from the same amount of density of wood fibers, this is different. We have really hard end grain, which are harder to cut, and then we have easy to cut side grain, then end grain, side grain. The spindle gouge is not strong enough. It looks like it could be, but it's not strong enough to handle that cut. And people get into really bad situations where this tool can actually snap in half and cause some serious damage and injury. So you never use a spindle gouge to remove the bulk of the material on a bowl blank. Now, a spindle gouge can be used for a couple things on the bowl. I'll tell you what, let me use the bowl gouge to shape this a little bit, and I'll give you an example of what we can do with the spindle gouge here. Now, the bowl gouge is perfectly suited to turn bowls, obviously, and that's what we're going to do right now. I'm going to shape the outside of this bowl really quickly. What I'm doing here is I'm making bevel supported cuts. If you're not familiar with bevel writing, check out my bevel writing video. And I'm pointing the tip of the tool in the direction I want to make the cut. As I'm coming around, I'm rotating the handle to match the curve. And this is a very porous, it's a fir board actually, so it's going to have some tear out on the end grain. It's a very dry wood. Kiln dried wood is notorious for having tear outs. So those are all push cuts, even though I'm working kind of across this way, it's push cut. Now I'm going to do a shear scrape here to kind of smooth this out. Shear scrape is an amazing cut to put a nice refined edge or surface on the bowl. Okay, now I wanted to show you what we can do with the spindle gouge. So everything you just saw were relatively major cuts as far as removing material. Let me make this clear again. Never use the spindle gouge for making major cuts and removing material from a bowl, both on the outside and the inside of the bowl. Do not use a spindle gouge. because it does not have the strength for it. However, if I take the spindle gouge here, I can put a little detail in here. Let's take a look at this. I'm going to put a little V edge on the rim of this bowl. Just did a little curved edge there. If you wanted to get fancy with it, you could do a bead. You could do all sorts of different things with it. But what I was doing with the spindle gouge, is just a quick little detail here to make an example, is I'm just making a light decorative cut there. And I'm not doing anything elaborate as far as removing material. The other thing that I use a spindle gouge for on a bowl is to shape the inside dovetail of the tenon. When I'm forming tenons, I will use a straight-in push cut with the bull gouge to create a slight angle. It's about a 10-degree angle on the dovetail tenon. That way it grips my dovetail chuck, my 4-jaw chuck, properly. But other than that, I never use a spindle gouge for anything else on a bull blank or a side grain mounted blank of any type. You know, I started thinking about the main difference between the bull gouge and the spindle gouge, and it's the shape of the flute and the size of the material. You can see how relatively flat that spindle gouge is. Well, structurally, these side wings add strength as far as flexibility of this tool too. And where people get in trouble with any tool, but especially a spindle gouge used on a side grain bowl blank, which again, don't do that. Just keep the toilet paper in mind. If the piece is rotating like this on the lathe, you can use a spindle gouge. That's in grain or spindle turning. If it's rotating like this, that's a side grain mounted blank. Do not use the spindle gouge to remove material from that. Now again, you can reuse it for detail work or for forming that tenon, but don't use it for removing material. But I started to think about it. Where people get into trouble is with the tool rest. Instead of keeping that tool rest really close to the turning blank, they let the tool rest kind of get back farther. And when that happens, you have this big overlay and you have this leverage issue. What I was thinking about was the fact that that flute is so flat that it can fold basically, and the wings of the bull gouge are kind of like structurally holding that bull gouge and preventing it from bending or being folded. If there's any engineers out there, you might be able to explain to me what's going on there, because I think there's some physics involved. So I kind of mocked up this little paper bull gouge, which has more of like a U-shaped flute, and then I've also folded this piece of paper, and it's got a slight bow in it, kind of to match the spindle gouge. And what you realize quickly is that if you apply a little bit of pressure, and again, if you have the tool rest back far, which gets people in trouble, the spindle gouge model will fold very, very fast. However, those side wings structurally make the bull gouge more difficult to fold and snap. It's kind of interesting. If anybody knows anything why that occurs, or what the design of and the benefit of the supports of those side wings, if that's helping with that force, and if you're an engineer or a physicist or something like that, leave me a comment below. I'd love to know. Another factor to keep in mind too, if you were to accidentally use the spindle gouge while roughing out a bowl, is the fact that you have these big, wide, flat wings that are exposed. And what will most likely happen is you're going to engage a very large portion of that all at once. And that is going to cause a nasty catch, which is going to gouge out a bunch of wood, most likely from your bowl. So if the tool doesn't snap in half, it's probably going to give you nasty catches while you're trying to rough out side grain mounted bowls. So again, you just really want to avoid that. So remember, the spindle gouge can be used on all spindle turnings, and it can be used for detail work on bowl turnings, side grain bowl turnings. The bull gouge can be used for both turning side grain wood bowls and for doing in grain spindle turning. However, the detail limitations are limited by the size of the bevel on the tool. So you're not going to get as crisp of an edge with a spindle turning as you would with a spindle gouge. So that's the difference between the two. But just be certain not to be using a spindle gouge for bowl turning and removing large amounts of material. That's your biggest takeaway from this. I want you guys to be safe, and I want you to make the bowls that you love making, but I want you to be safe about it too. And it's great to know which tool to use, obviously. If you like this video, do me a huge favor, click the like button and subscribe. If you haven't started subscribing, please subscribe, and check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. If you haven't been there yet, and if you're interested in wood bowls, there is a ton of information there about anything you can think about pertaining to wood bowls. As a matter of fact, go to the search and search any topic that you can think of about wood bowl turning, and you're most likely going to come up with at least an article, if not several articles. So go check that out. And until next time, like I always like to say, happy turning.